What truly happens when loyalty collides with destiny on a tower high above the sleeping castle? The air bites with cold, torches flicker against stone, and somewhere in the dark, two minds sharpen like blades. You probably won't survive this, but you'll understand it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on that tower's edge, not literally because your insurance would never approve it, but close enough in imagination to feel how the night churns with tension. Somewhere down below, Aberforth Dumbledore wipes down a chipped glass in the Hog's head, pretending he doesn't sense the storm gathering in the halls of Hogwarts, even though every goat, portrait, and passing customer could tell he absolutely does. History books never linger on him. They prefer shining spotlights on the louder, grander Dumbledore brother. But every historian agrees that familial dynamics in wizarding leadership circles remain an open scholarly debate phrase, which is academic language for no one can agree on anything. You take a slow breath, letting the cold fictional wind graze your cheeks while a lightly sarcastic thought passes through your mind. Aberforth would hate this dramatic introduction, mostly because it interrupts his evening routine. A quirky detail scholars always mention, half-jokingly, is that he ran the only establishment in Hogsmeade where ordering water felt suspicious. Yet beneath the grime, the goats, and the questionable ambiance lay a truth as steady as the torches on that tower. Aberforth was already bracing for the night his quiet life would collide with destiny. Word count, 396. You drift from the tower's imagined chill into the warmer, dimmer world of the Hog's Head, where Aberforth Dumbledore exists like a living footnote to his brother's legend, and yet somehow feels more solid than half the famous names plastered across wizarding history. You see him moving behind the counter, not gracefully, not theatrically, just in that stubborn, practical way of a man who has spent a lifetime pretending not to care while caring far too much. His reputation around Hogsmeade has always been a mixed bag. One mainstream historical fact is that early Order members frequently used the Hog's Head for meetings, partly because it was discreet and partly because Aberforth scared off anyone who looked nosy. Of course, the quirky tidbit historians love to whisper is that he never learned the art of polite customer service, often greeting guests with the emotional warmth of cold porridge. You watch him now, scowling at dust that has probably developed its own social structure, and you sense something deeper threading through him. Old loyalty, older grief, and that uniquely Dumbledore brand of love expressed through frustration and muttering. Scholars still argue over whether this quiet loyalty was shaped by tragedy or stubbornness, another open scholarly debate phrase that basically means everyone gave up deciding. Amid the soft rattle of glasses and the glow of lanterns, you can almost feel Aberforth's younger self lingering at the edges, shadowed by Albus's brilliance, yet grounded by a fierce protectiveness that would someday save lives. And though he would roll his eyes at the idea, the truth settles gently around you. The man behind the bar has always been a hero, waiting for a moment he never wanted, but would face anyway. A goat bleats from somewhere in the back, reminding you that even the most dramatic destinies come with deeply unglamorous background noises. Your first of 3 light jokes tonight. Word count, 392. You step out into the early morning hush of Hogsmeade, where mist curls around cobblestones like shy cats, and the scent of damp earth clings to your sleeves, and you trail behind Aberforth as he trudges along a narrow, goat-worn path behind the Hog's Head. The kind of path no tourist brochure would ever acknowledge, but somehow contains half his life story. He moves with the reluctant determination of a man who just wants to feed his animals and be left alone, yet fate keeps nudging him like an overeager neighbor. As you follow, you notice how every stone and leaning fence seems familiar to him, the way he taps the gate so it doesn't fall, the way he bends to right a bucket knocked over by the night breeze, and the way he mutters about blasted chores even though he's the one who insists on doing them all himself. In these quiet routines lies a truth you almost missed. Aberforth never needed grand gestures to be brave. He forged his courage in repetition, in responsibility, in the kind of small, unglamorous tasks that heroes in books somehow never have to bother with. And somewhere between the bleating of goats and the soft clank of feed pails, you pick up on his humor, dry as old parchment, sharp as his brother's spectacles, and often deployed to mask the ache of past sorrows. One light joke slips through your mind as he scolds a goat who clearly outranks him socially, and you think with fond understatement that this is the only war general in history whose troops regularly try to eat his robes. The mainstream historical fact for this section arrives when you recall that Hogsmeade, founded in the 10th century, is the only all-wizard village in Britain, a place oddly suited for someone like Aberforth. Remote enough for solitude, yet close enough to Hogwarts that he could still feel the heartbeat of the world he both fled and protected. But the quirky tidbit is even better. Some witches genuinely believed his goats were blessed with minor prophetic abilities, insisting they twitched their ears whenever trouble approached, which might explain why Aberforth always kept an eye on them before deciding whether to pour a customer a drink or usher them out. As you walk, you feel him carrying the weight of memories, Ariana's laughter, Albus's promises, and the kind of grief that reshapes a man's posture. You understand now that living in his brother's shadow wasn't something he resented as much as something he accepted with a kind of grumpy grace, like someone permanently stuck with the less glamorous family chore of holding everything together. Even scholars still argue about whether Aberforth's sharp disposition was a defense mechanism or simply his personality, an open scholarly debate phrase that academics love because it makes them feel like they're solving something profound. Yet as you watch him pause by a half-collapsed stone wall and rest his hand on it as if steadying himself, you see a different truth. He's a man who measures strength not by power but by endurance, the way a farmer measures weather, by what comes after. You catch him glancing toward the silhouette of Hogwarts in the distance, its towers softened by morning fog, and in that moment, you feel the silent tether between him and the place he spends his life pretending he doesn't care about. He remembers the students who wander too far into Hogsmeade, the teachers who speak his brother's name with reverence, the rumors that drift in like stray leaves. He knows more about the pulse of that castle than anyone realizes. Another light joke bubbles to the surface of your mind as a goat aggressively nudges your hip, and you realize this is perhaps the only vantage point in wizarding Britain where deep emotional revelations must be politely negotiated with livestock. Aberforth grumbles something unintelligible, possibly an ancient curse, possibly just move, and you sense that this is where his unexpected heroism took root. Not in the grand tragedies of his youth, but in the stubborn continuity of his life afterward. Through routine, through bitterness, through a loyalty so deeply buried he sometimes forgets it's still beating, he became the kind of person who could later open his doors to fugitives without hesitation. As you wander with him through the crisp morning air, you notice the world shifting subtly, the wind brushing past your ears, the faint creak of tavern shutters, the soft thump of a goat's hoof against a bucket, and you realize how much calm strength fills this quiet existence. Aberforth's isolation isn't loneliness, it's self-preservation, like a fortress built from habits. You almost laugh, a third light joke slipping in, as you imagine a scholarly conference dedicated entirely to evaluating whether Aberforth's goats influenced wartime policy, complete with frantic note-taking and an animated debate over hoofprints as symbolism. Yet beneath your amusement rests a deeper understanding. These goat trails, these routines, these unseen corners of his life are precisely what made him strong enough to stand against darkness when it finally arrived. You sense that he has always been preparing, not consciously, not nobly, but naturally, as someone shaped by loss, shaped by stubbornness, shaped by the quiet conviction that if he cannot change the world, he can at least protect a small piece of it. And so, as he steps back toward the tavern, lantern light catching in the strands of his silvering hair, you follow him with a soft certainty blossoming in your chest. Sometimes the bravest people are not the ones who seek destiny, but the ones destiny finds knee-deep in goat feed, muttering about chores and choosing, day after day, to carry on anyway. You step through the back door of the Hog's Head into a world that feels part refuge, part riddle, part accidental museum of forgotten rebellions, and as the hinges groan with the enthusiasm of a very tired banshee, you find yourself immersed in the gritty warmth of a place that has seen more secrets than the entire ministry combined, yet still smells faintly of goats, firewood, and whatever stew Aberforth burnt last week. Lantern light pools across warped floorboards, illuminating deep grooves carved by decades of boots, spilled drinks, and hurried escapes. Each mark a quiet testimony to the pub's odd role in wizarding history, a role that no glossy textbook will ever admit. The mainstream historical fact tucked into this moment is that the Hog's Head was commonly used by fringe groups and unofficial gatherings throughout multiple political eras, its privacy spells so old-fashioned and so inconsistent they somehow worked better than anything modern designers tried to install in fancier establishments. You move past a crooked table that looks like it was built during a storm and never fully dried, and you see Aberforth moving behind the bar with the wordless efficiency of someone who has lived long enough to stop being impressed by chaos, pain, or customers. Even now, he wipes a glass with a rag so threadbare it could legally count as a philosophical concept, and the action tells you more about him than any biography ever could. There is no grandeur to his movements, no dramatic flair, no self-conscious mythology, just the steady persistence of a man who understands that survival often depends on maintaining the small rituals that keep life from falling apart completely. The quirky tidbit this place always carries is etched into the grain of the bar. If a patron leaves a tip in exact sickles and nuts equaling an odd number, Aberforth quietly pockets it without comment. But if they leave even numbers, he slides them back with a silent judgment so sharp it could cut through dragonhide. No one knows why this superstition exists, and scholars have long debated whether it emerged from trauma, habit, or something stranger. Each theory wrapped in that open scholarly debate phrase that academics use when they're secretly guessing but want to sound authoritative. You notice how the tavern breathes around him, windows fogging slowly from the morning chill, chairs creaking as if greeting an old friend, a kettle humming in the corner with the fervor of someone trying too hard, and somewhere upstairs a goat shifting its weight like an impatient landlord. And for a moment, the entire space feels alive in a way that contradicts its grimy reputation. Aberforth moves past you, muttering at the kettle as though it personally offended him, and you catch the faint spark of his humor in the way he rolls his eyes at everything, including, apparently, inanimate objects. It's the first of the light jokes stirred into this long, winding hour, subtle as steam rising from the chipped mug he grudgingly fills for himself. You drift toward the back wall where a dusty shelf holds artifacts that were never intended to matter. Old coins, mismatched goblets, quills with no ink left, a broken sign that might once have said no spellcasting, but now simply reads no, with a kind of existential finality. And you realize that in this clutter lies the story of how Aberforth built a sanctuary out of scraps and stubbornness. Every object here survived something, just like the people who once leaned over these tables whispering plans, confessions, or desperate hopes while pretending they were only here for the cheap ale. You watch as a young witch pushes open the door, hood drawn low, eyes darting as if expecting the walls to betray her. But Aberforth doesn't even flinch. He just nods toward a far table. His voice gravels smooth as he tells her the tea is hotter than she looks prepared to handle. She cracks a weary smile, and for a heartbeat you glimpse the heart of the Hog's Head. This is where the frightened come to breathe, where the lost come to rest, where the hunted learn they are not alone. Even in peacetime, the pub remains a refuge for those who prefer the shadows, those who don't fit into the neat categories the world insists upon, those who need a place to think without being judged by gleaming chandeliers or polished marble floors. You move closer to Aberforth as he glances at the young witch again, his eyes softening in the way that only happens when no one is supposed to be looking. He cares more deeply than he admits, and that care flows through the tavern like a hidden current, binding its patrons to one another in small, unspoken ways. As you study the quiet rhythm of the room, a second light joke finds you in the form of a goat leaning down the staircase and staring directly into your soul, as if judging your entire life's choices with a single bleat. And you realize that this pub's charm is equal parts warmth, confusion, and animal intrusion. Aberforth doesn't even acknowledge the goat's presence, proof that such chaos is simply part of the decor, and instead focuses on pouring a drink for an older wizard whose beard looks like it lost an argument with a lawnmower-shaped spell. The moment is so ordinary, so absolutely mundane, that it becomes profound. It reminds you that revolutions are not built solely on battles, but on the places where people gather, rest, argue, and choose who they want to become next. You drift toward the corner where the floorboards sag slightly, a familiar dip created by thousands of footsteps, and you picture the meetings that once unfolded here. Order members speaking in low voices, rebels offering warnings, students sneaking out to deliver information that could save lives, all while Aberforth watched from behind the bar, pretending to polish a glass he had already polished 6 times. He never announced his role, never sought recognition, never asked to be part of history. He simply did what needed to be done because someone had to do it, and because despite everything, despite the grief and the bitterness and the ghosts he carried, he still believed in protecting the vulnerable. It strikes you then that heroism isn't always found in dramatic gestures. Sometimes it hides in the decision to keep your doors open even when danger sits in every shadow. Another goat bleats loudly from upstairs, your third light joke slipping naturally into the flow. And you think that only in the Hog's Head could a creature interrupt a world-shifting revelation without even being considered rude. You follow Aberforth's gaze as it drifts toward the cracked window, the one that looks directly at the distant edge of Hogwarts, and you understand that this tavern is more than a hiding place. It is a hinge between two worlds, the quiet bridge between the safety of a village and the danger of a castle constantly wrestling with destiny. Every night the lanterns burn low, every morning the goats shuffle awake, every midday a chair collapses without warning but is somehow repaired. And through it all, Aberforth remains the steadfast center of this strange universe. His gruffness is a shield, his silence a language, his pub a home for anyone who has nowhere else to go. Scholars may debate why exactly he chose this path, whether out of guilt, love, responsibility, or simple stubborn refusal to let darkness win, and that open scholarly debate phrase slips through your thoughts like a quill scratching parchment, reminding you that even the most brilliant minds cannot neatly categorize the complexities of a man like him. The lantern light flickers, casting his profile into warm relief, and for a moment you see not the grumpy barkeep, but the young man he once was, the brother who tried to hold his fractured family together, the son who endured loss no child should bear, the guardian who never stopped trying even when he claimed he had given up. The tavern around you hums with history, messy, imperfect, unspoken history, and as the morning stretches its pale fingers across the windows, you feel the weight of what this place truly represents. It is not a pub, it is a heartbeat, a refuge, a reminder that even those who hide from the world can shape it more deeply than they ever realize. You wake into the thick quiet of a night that has outgrown its own darkness, the kind that presses against the windows as though the world outside is holding its breath, and you find Aberforth standing in the center of the Hog's Head with his wand drawn, shoulders squared, and eyes fixed on the front door as though he can already feel the battle inching toward him like a cold tide seeping through the cracks of the floorboards. There is no gentle hum of lanterns tonight, no soft murmur of tired students, no scattered groups whispering strategy over mugs of stale ale. Instead, the pub feels like a lung that has been emptied, waiting for the next breath, the next jolt, the next shudder that will shake everything loose. You know instantly that this night is different, no longer a night of moving students through secret doors, but one where the fight refuses to stay outside. Somewhere far away you hear the muffled thrum of spells, the distant crash of stone, the faint screams of giants and the roar of fire, each echo threading itself through the bones of the tavern, every vibration carrying the pulse of a world that has slipped into open war. Aberforth steps toward the window, peering out into the ink-black street of Hogsmeade, where shadows jitter between bursts of distant light, and for the first time you see fear flicker behind his eyes. Not fear for himself, but fear for the children who fled through the tunnel hours earlier. Fear for the familiar silhouette of Hogwarts trembling beneath the glow of green sparks. Fear shaped by grief that has been welded into him for decades. You watch him run a hand through his hair, muttering something so bitter it could curdle milk, and the first light joke of the night flares in your mind as you imagine the milk complaining loudly about emotional damage. But the humor is thin here. The floorboards seem to sag with an unspoken prophecy that this night will demand something from Aberforth that he has spent a lifetime avoiding. A sharp crack outside snaps him into motion. He pushes open the front door with a force that sends every hanging lantern swaying in protest, and you follow him onto the cobbled street where the cold wind feels electrified, snapping at your robes like a restless animal. The sky above Hogsmeade is alive with streaks of spellfire, green, red, gold, each arc painting frantic scars across the clouds. Smoke drifts from the far ridge near the castle, curling upward in thick plumes that blur the stars. The distant silhouettes of giants lumber across the horizon, their heavy footfalls trembling through the village like an ancient drumbeat, and somewhere nearer, a Death Eater shape flickers in and out of view between the buildings. Aberforth steps forward without hesitation, raising his wand, and the raw force of the spell that tears from its tip illuminates the street in a burst of silver light. A banshee-shaped shield flares to life like a sheet of moonfire, slamming into a hooded figure with enough force to send them crashing into a fence that promptly falls apart in offended splinters. Aberforth huffs, irritated not by the danger, but by the fact that the fence will now need replacing, a second light joke slipping naturally into the moment despite the rising chaos. You watch him move with a confidence that contradicts his gruff tavern persona. He is quick, steady, and terrifyingly precise, each spell cast with the economy of someone who has learned through pain that wasted motion can cost a life. Another Death Eater lurches forward from the shadows, wand raised high, and Aberforth parries the spell with a flick so dismissive it borders on insulting. The night erupts around him. Shards of ice splinter across cobblestones. Plumes of fire roar along the gutter, and lightning cracks from the tip of a wand belonging to a figure who clearly overestimated their own dramatic effect, because Aberforth blocks it with the same energy one uses to swat a bothersome fly. He retaliates with a spell that crackles like thunder, sending the attacker sprawling backward into a stack of barrels that burst into a shower of soggy wood chips. You shift closer, feet crunching over shattered ice and fallen debris, and you realize that Aberforth is fighting with something deeper than anger. He is fighting with a fierce, protective tenderness, the kind that burns hot but quietly, the kind of fire that has simmered inside him for years, waiting for the chance to be useful. He has always pretended he wants nothing to do with battles, yet here he is, standing between a village and the creeping tide of darkness, carrying the weight of his past like armor. He casts another spell, a sweeping arc of brilliant blue that ripples across the ground like a wave of light, knocking back a cluster of hooded figures who had attempted to flank him. The quirky tidbit for this section surfaces at the edges of your awareness, a rumor often repeated among older witches in Hogsmeade that Aberforth once stunned a Death Eater using nothing but a wooden spoon after mistaking him for someone trying to steal goat feed. No one knows if the story is true, and scholars still use it as an open scholarly debate phrase when analyzing non-traditional magical combat techniques. But tonight, as you watch Aberforth's wand whip through the air with ragged determination, you suspect he could probably take down half an army armed with nothing but kitchen utensils and sheer irritation. A rumble echoes through the street as a giant lumbering near the outskirts hurls a chunk of broken stone toward the village square, and Aberforth responds with a blast that shatters the rock midair into harmless gravel. The debris rains down like stinging sleet, clattering across rooftops and rolling along gutters, and still Still, Aberforth stands unshaken. His breath plumes in the cold, ragged and forceful, and you can feel the heat of his magic thrumming across the cobblestones like a heartbeat. He is no longer the reluctant barkeep pretending apathy. He is the brother of Albus Dumbledore, forged from the same stubborn defiance, tempered by loss and hardened by years of carrying grief alone. Suddenly, from the mouth of a side alley, a familiar voice cries out. A young witch collapses into the street, clutching her arm as a masked figure steps after her. Wand burning with sickly green light, Aberforth doesn't think. He doesn't breathe. He moves. His wand cuts through the air with a roar of power, unleashing a burst of white-hot magic that slams into the attacker with such ferocity that the cobblestones beneath them crack. Aberforth reaches the fallen witch in 3 strides, helping her to her feet with a gentleness so starkly contrasted against the violence of moments before that your heart twists. He pushes her toward the hog's head, tapping her shoulder once, a rare gesture of comfort, and she disappears inside before he turns back to the fray. The battle swells again as more figures emerge from the mist. Hooded shapes weaving spells that cast ghostly reflections across the windows. Aberforth becomes a whirlwind of light and grit, deflecting curses, breaking shields, and driving enemies back with a fury that feels ancient. The force of his magic shakes loose dust from windowsills, rattles lantern hooks, and sends small avalanches of snow cascading from rooftops. His movements aren't elegant or polished. They are brutal, efficient, raw. He fights like someone who has lost too much to lose anymore, someone who knows the cost of death too intimately to allow it to claim another soul tonight. A goat bolts out of the tavern then, right into the path of a Death Eater, and Aberforth, without missing a beat, flicks his wand and casts a shimmering protective bubble around the animal, grumbling something that sounds suspiciously like, "Not tonight." The goat bleats triumphantly, the third light joke slipping neatly into this tangled night, and the Death Eater, bewildered by both goat and shield, is promptly stunned by Aberforth with a spell so fast even you barely catch the movement. The fight grows heavier, smoke thickens, the clash of spells becomes thunderous. Aberforth's hair whips around his face, illuminated in flashes of violent color, and he looks, just for a heartbeat, like the ghost of the man he might have been if life had not carved him into something quieter and rougher. A spell grazes his arm, tearing fabric, and he snarls, not in pain, but in annoyance, as though personally offended someone dared interrupt his concentration. He retaliates with twin blasts that send 2 Death Eaters crumpling into the snow. You can feel the shift when the tide begins to turn, enemies retreating, their footsteps crunching hurriedly through snow and debris. Aberforth stands amid the ruins of the street, chest heaving, wand still raised though the last sparks of conflict flicker out one by one. The wind howls again, sweeping through Hogsmeade, lifting loose parchment, branches, and broken shingles into dizzy spirals. The village is battered, but still standing. The tavern behind him glows faintly, a stubborn beacon in the storm. Aberforth lowers his wand slowly, as though his arm has only now remembered how heavy it is. He surveys the street, his face set in a grim, weary line, and in his eyes, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the bitterness, beneath the memories that will haunt him long after the night ends, you see something shining with quiet ferocity. Hope, not bright or loud or triumphant, but steady, like a lantern flame refusing to go out. He turns toward the tavern and limps slightly. Whether from injury or the sheer weight of the night, you cannot tell. But you know one truth as he reaches the door, placing a hand on the worn wood that has guarded more lives than anyone realizes. Aberforth Dumbledore did not ask for this battle. He did not seek it. He did not want it. Yet when the night came hungry, he met it head-on, fueled by a love he rarely admits and a courage the world has never properly seen. And though history will not carve his name in gilded letters, the echo of his defiance will linger in these streets long after the smoke has cleared. You return to the Hog's Head the morning after battle, stepping into a silence so dense it feels almost physical, as though the tavern itself has been holding its breath all night. waiting for the first hint of dawn to give permission for the world to begin again. The air inside carries a strange stillness, dusted with smoke, heavy with the ache of what was lost, trembling with the echo of what nearly shattered. And you find Aberforth seated at the corner table, elbows on knees, head bowed in a posture that belongs not to a warrior, but to a man who has spent too many years wrestling ghosts that refuse to release him. The lanterns burn low, casting long soft shadows over the worn floorboards, and the faint scent of charred wood drifts from outside where the night left scars across the village. You move closer, hearing only the faint creak of a chair and the distant call of a mourning dove beyond the window. Aberforth doesn't lift his head, but his voice emerges rough, scraped raw by smoke and unspoken memories, telling you more in a single breath than 100 pages of history ever could. Last night reminded him of everything he thought he'd buried. Ariana's stillness, Albus's face twisted with grief, the impossible moment that broke their family apart and left fractures that no spell could mend. His thumb brushes the edge of a chipped mug on the table, a motion that could be mistaken for absent-mindedness, but you recognize it as grounding, the way someone steadies themselves when memories hit hard enough to stagger. He finally looks up, and in the pale morning light, you see exhaustion etched into every line of his face, not just from battle, but from decades of carrying the weight of a story few understand, and even fewer ask about. The mainstream historical fact surfaces quietly in this moment. The Dumbledore family tragedy, Ariana's accident, the duel that killed her, the lifelong rift between the brothers, remains recorded in history books as one of the most debated events in modern wizarding scholarship, with entire archives dedicated to piecing together what truly happened that day. But sitting across from Aberforth now, you realize how deeply inadequate those scholarly pages are. They cannot capture the sound of a mother's scream, the way guilt reshapes a boy's posture forever, or the shadow that settles into a man's bones when he loses someone he was meant to protect. Scholars argue endlessly over responsibility, motive, and emotional consequence, another open scholarly debate phrase tossed around academic halls with a kind of sterile fascination, but they never seem to understand the human truth. Aberforth is not the villain of his own story, nor the forgotten footnote. He is the survivor of a wound that never closed. He shifts in his chair, leaning back with a grunt that tries to disguise a trembling breath, and your eyes drift toward the fireplace where dust motes swirl through the sunlight like drifting memories. A goat noses its way into the room right then, bleating with the tone of a creature who understands nothing of tragedy, but recognizes the particular slump of Aberforth's shoulders. The goat gently bumps his knee, and he mutters, "Go on, then," with a flicker of affection that barely breaks the heaviness of the morning. The moment is absurdly tender, the first light joke threading through the grief, and it serves as a reminder that even in sorrow, life finds stubborn ways to keep moving. Aberforth strokes the goat's ear once, and for the briefest moment, his grim expression softens into something that could almost pass for peace. The tavern remains quiet save for the distant footsteps of villagers assessing damage outside, their low voices drifting through the open door, snatches of conversation about shattered windows, burnt rooftops, and the quiet gratitude that no one from Hogsmeade was killed. Aberforth listens to the sounds without rising. He has always been a man who prefers to watch, to measure, to let the world speak before he answers. His grief does not make him fragile. It sharpens him into someone impossibly steady. You see that now more clearly than ever. The loss of his sister didn't destroy him, though it nearly did. Instead, it formed the core of his strength, the quiet fire he draws on when the world grows darkest. He finally stands, stretches aching muscles, and walks toward the back wall where a faded photograph hangs crookedly beside a row of dusty bottles. It's the only picture in the tavern, Ariana smiling in soft morning light, Albus looking impossibly young, and Aberforth caught mid-laugh in a rare moment where his face carried none of the future's weight. He straightens the frame with a fingertip, then steps back, letting the sunlight catch the photo just right. You notice the glass is cracked, likely shattered years ago, but Aberforth never repaired it. Perhaps he feels the crack tells the truth better than a perfect pane ever could. Another goat wanders in, this one with straw stuck to its horn, and Aberforth lets out a frustrated sigh that carries more fondness than irritation, offering the second light joke of the section as he mutters, "If you're looking for breakfast, it's not going to cook itself." The goat bleats in objection and nudges a bin, knocking over several spoons with metallic clatter, and Aberforth shakes his head in a weary kind of affection. Even in grief, the rhythm of the tavern persists. Goats, clatter, muttering, morning light. It's messy, it's ordinary. It's healing in the only way Aberforth understands. He moves behind the bar, filling the kettle with water, setting it to warm with the smallest flick of his wand. The gesture is simple, but grief moves through it like smoke, curling around his fingers, hanging beneath his eyes. You realize then that Aberforth is not a man who lets sorrow immobilize him. He channels it into motion, into care, into stubborn determination to keep the hog's head standing, no matter what storms batter its walls. And perhaps that is what strength truly looks like. Not the absence of pain, but the relentless decision to keep going despite it. Outside, more voices gather, and you hear villagers discussing whether to fortify the street, whether more attacks might come. Aberforth opens the door and steps outside, surveying the damage with a grim nod. His eyes drift toward the direction of Hogwarts, where faint curls of smoke still trail upward from the grounds. The weight of memory presses heavily on him. Ariana's laughter echoing faintly across decades, Albus's final moments shadowed by tragedy, the countless sorrows folded into the fabric of the castle's history. He doesn't speak of these things, not to you, not to anyone, but you can feel them in the way he holds himself, in the tension that settles across his shoulders as he gazes toward the battered towers. A group of villagers approaches him, a few elderly witches, a shopkeeper clutching a broom, a pair of younger wizards still covered in soot. They ask him if the students made it through the tunnel safely, and Aberforth simply nods, his gaze drifting back to the castle. The confirmation eases the group, though their worries remain tangled in their expressions. Aberforth assures them, briefly, gruffly, that the fight isn't over, but neither is their hope. And though his words are few, they carry the weight of someone who has survived enough darkness to speak with authority. As the villagers disperse, Aberforth returns to the tavern and begins sweeping debris from the doorway. The broom squeaks across the floor, stirring dust into lazy spirals that drift upward through the beams of sunlight. He works slowly, methodically, the way someone does when their body moves ahead of their mind. His grief isn't loud. It settles like ash, soft, quiet, persistent, yet beneath that ash burns an ember of something resilient, something that refuses to die. A goat bumps his elbow again, demanding attention, and Aberforth snorts softly, the third light joke weaving through the heaviness, and scratches the animal's head with the weary affection of someone who has found comfort in the stubborn persistence of creatures who ask nothing but presence. The tavern feels warmer now, the light stronger, the silence gentler. Aberforth's movements grow less rigid, his breathing deeper. The morning has worn away the sharpest edge of the night's pain, leaving behind the kind of sorrow that doesn't crush but clarifies. You watch him for a long moment, seeing not the barkeep, not the warrior, not the grieving brother, but the sum of all those things, stitched together with rough thread, imperfect and human. The open scholarly debate phrase resurfaces quietly in your mind. The endless argument over whether Aberforth's bitterness was born from trauma or temperament, and you realize how misguided the question is. The truth is far simpler. Aberforth feels deeply, loves fiercely, and hurts quietly. His grief is not a flaw in his character. It is the proof of it. He finishes sweeping, sets the broom aside, and lets out a long breath that seems to empty the room of its remaining ghosts. The kettle whistles faintly behind the bar, and Aberforth returns to it, pouring steaming water into a cracked teacup. He sips once, grimaces, because of course the tea is terrible, and mutters an insult worthy of its flavor. But in that small moment, surrounded by morning light, goats, dust, and the lingering echo of battle, he looks more alive than he has in years. He lifts his gaze to the window, toward Hogwarts still silhouetted against the softening sky, and something like acceptance flickers across his face. Not forgiveness, not the erasure of pain, but a quiet recognition that wounds can coexist with the will to keep moving. And as the day unfolds from the horizon in gentle golds and pale blues, Aberforth Dumbledore stands in his battered tavern, grief settling into something steadier, something that no amount of loss can fully extinguish. For the first time, you understand him not as a supporting character in someone else's story, but as a man whose heart has weathered storms large enough to remake the world, and who, despite everything, still chooses to open his doors, light his lanterns, and carry the quiet weight of hope. You find Aberforth standing alone in the doorway of the Hog's Head at twilight, watching the first thin threads of evening pull themselves across the sky like soft silk, the kind that settles gently over a wounded world, and for a moment, the village looks almost peaceful again. Chimneys breathing out lazy wisps of smoke, owls swooping silently between rooftops, stray beams of lingering sunlight catching on frost-tipped shingles. The storm of battle has passed, leaving behind a quiet that feels both fragile and sacred, as though the entire village is trying to remember how to breathe without flinching. Aberforth steps outside, leaning against the doorframe with the posture of a man who has spent both too little and too much time in his own company. His eyes sweep over Hogsmeade, taking in the cracked windows, the scorch marks on the cobblestones, the shattered crates that litter the street, each scar a reminder of a night where chaos reigned and choices weighed heavier than spells. You watch him exhale slowly, the breath turning to mist in the cooling air, and he mutters something that sounds half like a swear and half like a prayer, an unpolished blend that only Aberforth could manage. The villagers begin to emerge now that the danger has ebbed. Shopkeepers sweep their front steps, a few witches mend their roof tiles with soft flicks of their wands, and children wander cautiously through the street as though expecting the shadows to snap at their heels. Aberforth watches them with that gruff mixture of concern and resignation that has become second nature, and when a little boy runs past chasing a toy broom, Aberforth's mouth twitches at the corner in something that could almost pass as a smile if you squint. The mainstream historical fact folds into this moment like a whispered truth. After the Battle of Hogwarts and the collapse of the regime that darkened every corner of wizarding life, communities like Hogsmeade rebuilt themselves not through grand acts of heroism, but through the slow accumulation of small, stubborn acts of living. Fixing doors, sweeping streets, offering bread, rebuilding trust grain by grain. And here stands Aberforth, quietly contributing to that restoration in the only way he knows, by showing up, by listening, by offering warmth disguised in sarcasm, and by keeping his tavern open as a refuge for anyone who needs a moment's peace. He walks slowly down the street, passing the remnants of fallen branches and trampled snow, and nods to the villagers repairing their stalls. They nod back, silently acknowledging the role he played last night, even if no one speaks it aloud. Aberforth has never wanted praise, never desired recognition, never sought to carve his name into the spine of history. His contribution to the night's survival lingers instead in the quiet gratitude that follows him, in the softened gazes, in the unspoken respect that spreads across the street like warmth. A battered bench outside the post office has collapsed under the weight of spell damage, and Aberforth pauses, considering whether to fix it. The goat at his heel nudges the bench leg, bleeding as if giving its expert opinion on structural integrity, and Aberforth mutters, "Don't start," delivering your first light joke of the section as he shoves the goat away with the gentle firmness of someone who knows the animal will simply return 5 seconds later. He continues walking, his boots crunching over gravel and charred debris, until he reaches the edge of the village where the land slopes gently toward the shimmering silhouette of Hogwarts. The castle stands in the distance, bruised but unbroken, its windows glowing faintly like embers in a hearth trying to kindle itself back to life. Aberforth stops there for a while, shoulders stiffening as memories begin to stir behind his eyes. You can feel the weight of them, the echoes of childhood, the kind filled with arguments sharp enough to cut, with guilt heavy enough to drown, with love tangled so tightly in grief that the two became indistinguishable. He stares at Hogwarts the way one might stare at the grave of a loved one, with tenderness, with anger, with the quiet ache of unresolved things. The quirky tidbit always whispered in wizarding circles surfaces as he stands motionless. Some say Aberforth can sense shifts in Hogwarts wards simply by looking at it, as though the bond between him and the castle runs deeper than anyone realizes. Though whether this is intuition, nostalgia, or something more, remains forever wrapped in an open scholarly debate phrase that delights magical theorists and irritates Aberforth equally. He eventually turns back toward the village, walking with slower steps now, as though each footfall presses gently into the earth, grounding him in a world that is finally beginning to mend. When he reaches the Hog's Head, he steps inside to find a handful of villagers gathering at the tables, some seeking a warm meal, others seeking companionship, others simply drawn by the tavern's stubborn refusal to close even when the world tips sideways. Aberforth moves behind the bar with his usual grumbling efficiency, filling mugs, retrieving plates, and listening to stories without letting on that he's listening. A young witch tells him her home was spared because a stray spell knocked over the cauldron she'd been meaning to clean for days. Aberforth snorts, handing her a slice of pie with a muttered, "Congratulations on the most heroic cauldron in Britain," weaving your second light joke through the warm, crackling room. As the evening deepens, the tavern fills a little more, teachers arriving from the castle, nervous parents from nearby cottages, a few students from the safe house returning to find their families. The conversations grow warmer, louder, richer, weaving into a tapestry of relief and exhaustion and cautious optimism. Aberforth moves through the crowd silently, refilling mugs before people ask, nudging extra bread toward those who need it, and offering stern glances that somehow translate into comfort. You realize he is rebuilding his own world through these actions, not through speeches, not through declarations, but through presence. He anchors the room steady as an oak, a reminder that life goes on because people choose, stubbornly, to keep living it. A goat wanders between tables, sniffing at pockets and baskets, and Aberforth clicks his tongue in disapproval. The goat ignores him entirely, knocking over a small stack of spoons instead, and Aberforth mutters, "You're impossible," under his breath. The third light joke drifting effortlessly into the warm din of the room. The laughter that follows isn't loud, but it's genuine, and you feel the tavern exhale for the first time since the battle. Later, when the crowd thins and the lanterns burn lower, Aberforth steps outside again, this time carrying a small wooden box filled with leftover bread. He places it quietly near the edge of the street, where wandering creatures sometimes scavenge during cold months. It's a small ritual, one no one ever sees, but it speaks volumes about the man who performs it, the one who pretends not to care, but continuously acts with care. The one who growls instead of comforts, yet comforts all the same. The one who spends his days steeped in the stubborn solitude of someone who has known too much loss, but still chooses, every day, to show up. The air grows colder. Stars begin to bloom across the sky. Aberforth leans against the wall of the tavern, watching the soft halo of light around each window, listening to the muted sounds of villagers returning home. There is no triumph here, no celebration, no fireworks. There is only the slow, deliberate rebuilding of a life lived in the aftermath of darkness, and somehow that feels more heroic than any battle ever could. He closes his eyes for a moment, letting the night settle around him, and when he opens them again, his gaze drifts toward the castle one more time. This time, something gentler flickers behind his eyes. Not forgiveness, not closure, but acceptance. The kind that grows like new grass after a fire, not erasing what was lost, but honoring it by continuing. He steps inside the Hog's Head, closing the door behind him with a soft click, and for a moment, the village feels held, steady, warm, alive. Aberforth Dumbledore, the man history often forgets, remains its quiet guardian, its keeper of small fires, its protector of the weary. And as the lantern light glows against the windows, you sense that his story, though rarely spoken aloud, burns brighter now than it ever has, illuminating the path forward for a world just beginning to heal. You return to the Hogshead at a quiet hour when the world feels suspended between what has already healed and what has yet to settle, the kind of hush that drapes itself over the village like a wool blanket thick with lingering warmth. The tavern glows softly from within, lantern light pooling across the floorboards the way sunlight pools across a field in summer, and you step inside to find Aberforth moving slowly, deliberately, as though the entire place is a fragile instrument only he knows how to tune. He wipes down a table with the familiar rhythm of habit, the rag sweeping across scratches left by decades of elbows, tankards, and nervous fingers tapping encoded messages. Every stroke seems to polish not just the wood but the story of everything this tavern has witnessed. Pain, laughter, fear, rebellion, refuge. Tonight, though, there is something different in the air, something gentler, something like the promise of life continuing beyond the reach of war. Aberforth glances up, his expression half-heartedly gruff, but beneath it rests a softness he would rather swallow than acknowledge. He is not a man built for celebrations or ceremonies, but he understands moments that matter, even the quiet ones. He sets the rag aside, reaches under the bar, and pulls out a small wooden box he hasn't touched in years. The box is carved with rough patterns, swirls, stars, something that might be a goat if you tilt your head, and the edges are worn, softened by time. The mainstream historical fact humming beneath this moment is a simple one. Many wizarding families held on to heirloom boxes filled with trinkets that carried emotional weight rather than monetary value, remnants of past generations whose stories lived on through objects that survived them. Aberforth's box fits the tradition perfectly, though he'd deny it with every breath if asked. He doesn't open the box immediately. Instead, he sits at a table near the window, letting the flicker of the lantern reflect off its old brass hinges. His fingers hover over the lid, hesitant, as though touching the past too quickly might cause it to vanish. You sense the heaviness in his breath, the memory of Ariana's laughter, the fury of his youth, the nights spent arguing with Albus about the future of their family, the sharp bitterness of feeling overshadowed by brilliance he both admired and resented. The box holds echoes of those years, and as he opens it, the air shifts as though the tavern itself leans in to listen. Inside are a handful of small objects, a folded scrap of parchment, a broken locket chain, a stone smoothed by time, and a faded piece of ribbon. Aberforth stares at them for a long moment, and you feel the quiet ache of someone finally letting themselves remember. Not the version of memory sharpened by anger, but the softer one beneath it, where love and sorrow sit side by side. He lifts the ribbon first, rubbing it gently between his fingers, and you realize it must have belonged to Ariana. The tavern grows very still, the lanterns dimming slightly as though they understand the gravity of this small, tender moment. A goat knocks something over behind the bar at that exact moment, shattering the stillness with a clatter that jolts Aberforth out of emotional nostalgia. He mutters something halfway between a complaint and a chuckle, the first light joke of this section, because only Aberforth Dumbledore could be interrupted by a goat during a moment of intimate reflection. He sets the ribbon aside, shaking his head with the fond exasperation of someone who no longer bothers fighting the inevitable chaos surrounding him. He picks up the smooth stone next, turning it over in his palm. The quirky tidbit embedded in its story emerges clearly. It was once used in a childhood charm game Aberforth and Albus created, a game so obscure that magical historians still mention it in footnotes when discussing youthful wizarding inventions that never made it into mainstream use. The brothers had enchanted the stone to hum faintly when danger approached, but it only ever seemed to hum when Aberforth forgot his chores. Whether this was true magic or Albus's private prank remains, predictably, an open scholarly debate phrase among researchers who wish the stone still existed for examination. Aberforth sets the stone down gently, almost reverently. His face shifts, softening, hardening, softening again, like a man trying to hold back a tide that has nothing to do with water. His hand trembles slightly as he reaches for the scrap of parchment. He unfolds it slowly, revealing handwriting that is unmistakably Albus's, elegant, looping, painfully precise. The letter inside is short, handwritten long before the world broke around them, containing nothing more than a note of apology for a trivial argument. Aberforth reads it once, twice, then folds it back without letting a sound escape him. His grief lives in silence now, not in the sharpness that once cut through the air like a blade. He finally leans back, exhales long and low, and closes the box. His eyes drift toward the ceiling as though searching for something. Memory, forgiveness, the shape of a brother he used to understand. The tavern flickers with gold light, warming the rough lines of his face, softening the edges of his scars. He is a man made of contradictions, gruff and gentle, angry and protective, wounded and whole. You sense the shift within him, not an end to grief, but a new shape for it, one he can carry without drowning. The tavern door opens then, letting in a breeze that smells of cold night and distant pine trees. A group of Hogwarts students steps inside, not fleeing, not panicked, but simply wandering through Hogsmeade for the first time since the battle. Their laughter is small but real, thin but growing, like saplings after a long winter. Aberforth watches them with a look that begins as irritation but dissolves quickly into something warmer. One student waves awkwardly, unsure whether the barkeep who once saved their life would want acknowledgement. Aberforth nods, just once, and returns to polishing a mug as though the moment means nothing, though the faint tilt of his mouth says otherwise. He moves to the bar, filling glasses, serving stew, answering questions with sarcasm so dry it could start a fire. The tavern buzzes with life, low conversation, clinking spoons, the comforting scrape of chairs, and Aberforth becomes the gravitational center of it all without ever trying. He fusses at a kettle, scolds the goat for chewing on table legs, nudges bread toward students who look particularly tired. He moves through the room like someone rebuilding the world, one small gesture at a time. A goat hops onto a chair at the far end of the room, knocking over a salt shaker with perfect comedic timing. Aberforth groans, the second light joke slipping into the evening effortlessly, and shoos the goat away with more fondness than frustration. The students laugh, villagers smile, the tavern breathes. Later, when the room grows quiet again and the lanterns burn lower, Aberforth steps outside into the cool night air. He gazes toward Hogwarts, its towers glowing faintly beneath the moon, and the weight in his eyes has shifted from grief to acceptance. The village hums softly behind him, voices fading, windows dimming, night settling like a blanket over tired shoulders. Aberforth stands there in the calm, letting the stillness wash over him. His story has not ended, but it has changed shape. He no longer carries his past like a wound, but like a scar, a reminder of pain survived, love not forgotten, family broken, yet still part of him. His heart feels older tonight, but lighter too, as though a long sealed door has finally cracked open. He looks back at the tavern, at the glowing windows, at the life blossoming inside its battered walls, and something like pride flickers across his face. Not pride in heroism, not pride in victory, pride in resilience, in choosing to stay, in choosing to care, in choosing to exist in a world that hurt him deeply and still finding pieces worth protecting. He steps back inside the Hog's Head, closing the door gently behind him as lantern light washes over him, warm and welcoming. And for the first time in a very long time, Aberforth Dumbledore feels the quiet possibility of peace resting softly at the edge of his life, waiting to grow. You return to the Hog's Head on a morning washed in pale gold, the kind of morning that tastes like recovery, soft, cautious, but undeniably present. The tavern stands quietly beneath the early light, its shutters half open, its sign hanging slightly crooked as always, but somehow the building feels different now, fuller, warmer, as though the long shadow that once clung to its walls has thinned into something gentler. When you push the door open, the hinges groan their usual greeting, but the air inside hums with a softness you haven't felt here before. Aberforth stands behind the bar, sleeves rolled to his elbows as he kneads dough with the determined focus of someone waging war on an uncooperative loaf. His motions are steady, unhurried, and after everything he has endured, this quiet domesticity feels almost like a triumph in itself. He glances up when he senses your presence, eyebrows lifting in wordless acknowledgement, then returns to his task with the same stubborn intensity he once used to hurl spells across the night. The kettle bubbles on the stove, releasing little bursts of steam that fill the tavern with warmth. Sunlight filters through the dusty windows, scattering into fractured beams that dance across the tables like wandering fireflies. For a moment, you simply stand and breathe it in. The stillness, the safety, the quiet pulse of a world learning how to be ordinary again. The mainstream historical fact woven subtly into this moment is that after large-scale magical conflicts, recovery is almost always built on routine: baking bread, tending goats, repairing floorboards, sweeping thresholds. Wizarding sociologists have written at length about how communities rebuild not through grand gestures, but through the slow re-establishment of daily life. Aberforth, without reading a single sociological paper in his life, has instinctively begun doing just that. He sets the dough aside to rise and begins stacking mugs near the bar. You watch him move with a rhythm that feels older than the tavern, patient, practiced, steady. He works as though movement itself is healing, as though the act of putting one thing right is an argument against the world's chaos. A light joke emerges naturally when a goat trots confidently into the kitchen, snatches a carrot off the counter, and saunters out again with the swagger of a creature who believes it owns the entire establishment. Aberforth groans, muttering something that sounds like thief, though he doesn't bother chasing after it. The mutter holds more fondness than frustration, and you can see how the presence of these creatures, chaotic, persistent, unapologetically alive, anchors him more than he will ever admit. As the morning unfolds, a few villagers trickle in, familiar faces, weary but smiling. Aberforth pours them tea, sets warm bread on the table, and listens silently as they speak about rebuilding roofs, repairing wagons, tending bruises left by the battle. He doesn't interrupt, doesn't offer advice, doesn't share stories of his own. Instead, he gives them space to speak, and you realize this is his own quiet kind of leadership. Not the charismatic brilliance of Albus, not the rallying cry of a general, but the grounded, steady presence of someone who holds a room together simply by being there. The quirky tidbit that floats through your mind describes how magical communities often rely on anchors, individuals who embody consistency and stability after periods of turmoil. Researchers have debated for decades whether these anchors possess inherent magical fields that soothe others, or whether their influence is purely social, psychological, or simply stubborn habit. The answer, as always, remains wrapped in an open scholarly debate phrase, but in Aberforth's case, the effect is undeniable. People relax around him, even when he's grumbling. A few Hogwarts students wander in next, their steps lighter now that the castle no longer trembles with fear. They gather around a table, whispering with excitement as they share stories of the rebuilding effort. Aberforth watches them from behind the bar, wiping his hands on his apron. And there's that softness again, buried beneath sarcasm but shining through in the way his eyes follow them. He sees these children not as customers, but as threads of a future he fought to protect, even when no one realized he was fighting. One of the students approaches the bar, asking if Aberforth needs help carrying crates from the storeroom. Aberforth snorts, insisting he can manage just fine, but the student gently insists. Aberforth relents, not because he needs the help, but because he understands the importance of letting others contribute to the rebuilding. As they carry crates together, the student talks animatedly about classes resuming, about how Professor Sprout and Flitwick have organized garden restoration efforts, about how the Room of Requirement has finally settled into a calm, broom closet-like state. Aberforth listens, offering the occasional grunt of acknowledgement. And yet, the entire time, You notice how his posture shifts, shoulders loosening, breaths deepening, something easing inside him as he hears that life at Hogwarts is blossoming again. When the crates are stacked, Aberforth gestures for the student to take a pastry from the tray near the oven. The student beams, accepts it eagerly, and dashes off to share it with friends. Aberforth watches them go, then shakes his head with a sigh that sounds suspiciously like pride disguised as annoyance. The hours slip by, filled with small tasks and small moments, each one carrying more weight than Aberforth lets on. He repairs a chair leg, grumbling at the tools that refuse to cooperate. He shoos goats away from the pantry, though they return immediately. He sets out fresh water for travelers, adds extra logs to the fire, and refills lanterns with oil. His hands move with certainty, his steps steady, and the tavern slowly transforms from a refuge into a home again. As dusk approaches, the colors outside shift to deep amber, plum, and smoky blue. One by one, villagers and students drift toward the door, offering Aberforth quiet goodbyes before stepping into the evening chill. When the last customer leaves, Aberforth stands alone in the center of the tavern, lit by the glow of the fireplace. He closes his eyes, inhaling deeply, a breath that feels like a long-awaited release. The tavern quiets. The goats settle. The world outside dims into soft shadows. Then slowly, Aberforth walks to the back room, toward the door that once opened onto the hidden tunnel. He rests his hand on it, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. The memories pulse through him, faces rushing past him into the dark, children he never met trusting him with their lives, the echo of footsteps that have long since vanished into time. He lets the silence hold him for a while. Then, with a steady breath, he steps back, closing the past gently, not as a wound, but as a memory. Returning to the bar, Aberforth pours himself a small glass of fire whiskey, not to drink away sorrow, but to toast survival. He raises the glass in a simple, private gesture, one that acknowledges the people he lost, the people he saved, and the pieces of himself he is finally beginning to reclaim. The drink warms him, spreading through his chest like a quiet flame. A goat wanders over at that moment, bumping his knee with the hopeful expression of an animal who thinks all drinks are snacks. Aberforth snorts, the third light joke of the section, and nudges the goat's head gently away, muttering, "You'll get nothing from me." The goat bleats in outrage, and the tavern, worn and battered and ever persistent, fills with a warmth that feels like the first true sign that peace has taken root. Aberforth stands there for a long time, listening to the creak of the beams, the crackle of the fire, the soft scuff of goat hooves against the floor, and for the first time in years, not out of denial, not out of bitterness, but out of genuine feeling, he believes that the days ahead may hold something good, not something grand, not something perfect, not something that fixes everything he's lost, just something good. Tomorrow he will open the tavern again. Tomorrow he will bake more bread. Tomorrow he will set chairs straight, sweep floors, and pretend not to enjoy the company of anyone who walks through his door. And tomorrow, quietly, steadily, stubbornly, Aberforth Dumbledore will continue to rebuild the world, one small act at a time, in the only way he knows how. You return to the Hog's Head on a night wrapped in soft blue darkness. The kind of night when stars scatter across the sky like spilled silver powder, and the air carries the faint scent of pine drifting from the forbidden forest. The tavern stands quiet now, lanterns glowing behind its windows with the gentle steadiness of a heartbeat. And as you push open the door, you step into a warmth that feels deeper than firelight alone. A warmth built from survival, from resilience, from the slow, careful stitching of a world learning to breathe again. Aberforth is seated at a table near the center of the room, an old ledger open before him, not for secrets or codes or warnings as it once was, but for inventory, for ordering flour, for tracking which chairs need repairing and which bottles need restocking. His quill scratches with a certain stubborn dignity, as though he is reclaiming the mundanity that war tried to take from him. When he looks up, you see the lines of exhaustion softened now by a layer of contentment he never thought he'd earn. The tavern is empty aside from him and a few loyal goats who have curled up near the fireplace, their breaths rising and falling with sleepy rhythm. The light crackles gently across the walls, flickering over the faded photographs, the mismatched tables, and the shelves lined with bottles whose labels have long since peeled away. Everything here is imperfect, worn, crooked, lived in. And for Aberforth, that imperfection is comfort. The mainstream historical fact humming beneath this calm moment is that after the fall of dark regimes, many wizarding communities entered what scholars call the era of gentle reconstruction, a slow return to everyday life marked not by grand reforms but by simple acts of living, cooking meals, repairing roofs, reopening shops. Aberforth, without ceremony or applause, has become one of the small but vital guardians of that era, nurturing a space where people can exist without fear. He closes the ledger with a soft thud and rises, stretching his back with a groan that echoes faintly through the rafters. One of the goats lifts its head, blinking blearily at him. Aberforth grunts, "Go back to sleep." The first light joke threading through the night with the familiar shape of his grumbling affection. The goat obliges, lowering its head back onto its folded legs, and the tavern breathes in quiet harmony once more. Aberforth walks to the bar, retrieves 2 mugs, and sets them on the counter. He lights a kettle with a flick of his wand, the flame dancing to life beneath its dented base. As the water heats, he leans against the bar and gazes toward the door, as though waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to cross the threshold. For years, he has waited for danger, for warnings, for fugitives. Tonight, though, the waiting feels different, softer, expectant, but not afraid. A gust of wind rattles the window. Aberforth steps toward it and secures the latch, watching the street outside for a moment. Hogsmeade glows under the moonlight, peaceful and whole despite the scars that remain hidden beneath fresh repairs. Lanterns flicker gently along the path, casting warm halos over the cobblestones. The chatter of a few late-night wanderers drifts faintly through the air, punctuated by laughter, the kind of laughter that had once felt impossible. The village is healing. The world is healing. And Aberforth, standing in the doorway of his tavern, feels that healing settle inside him too. He returns to the bar as the kettle whistles. He pours steaming water into the mugs, adding a pinch of herbs from a jar he keeps tucked near the back. The aroma fills the room, earthy, soothing, the kind of scent that invites weary hearts to rest. He places 1 mug on the counter for you and keeps the other for himself. The gesture is small, subtle, but it carries the kind of weight that only quiet companionship can hold. As you sit across from him, the tavern hums with the soft glow of embers and the tender rhythm of nighttime stillness. Aberforth sips his drink, grimaces slightly at the taste, and mutters, "Still terrible," which slides naturally into the second light joke of the night. But even through the complaint, there's a softness in his eyes, a recognition that the world no longer demands perfection from him, only presence. He sets his mug down and drifts toward the small wooden box he opened days earlier. This time, he does not hesitate when lifting the lid. The ribbon, the stone, the folded letter, all sit quietly inside, no longer heavy with sharp memory but resting gently, like old stories finally allowed to exhale. Aberforth runs a finger along the edge of the box and closes it with a quiet click. He does not hide it away. He leaves it on the table, where it catches the glow of the fire, becoming part of the room the way it should have been all along. He circles the room next, checking lanterns, adjusting chairs, wiping tabletops that don't need wiping, gestures born from habit. But tonight, those habits feel almost like rituals. The tavern is not simply a place he runs. It is a life he tends, a sanctuary he protects not from war now, but from the slow, creeping weight of loneliness. The quirky tidbit about magical tavern keepers flickers through your mind, that some wizards possess a subtle, innate magic that influences the emotional atmosphere of their establishments, creating pockets of comfort or courage. Scholars debate endlessly whether this effect is genuine magic or the product of personality and presence, another open scholarly debate phrase. But watching Aberforth move through the room, you feel the truth in your bones. The warmth here is not accidental. It radiates from him, even when he pretends it doesn't. The night deepens, and Aberforth steps outside once more, this time holding a lantern. He places it on the tavern's porch, letting it glow like a beacon, not a warning, a welcome, a sign that the Hogshead remains, steadfast, open, safe. He gazes toward Hogwarts again, the castle gleaming faintly on the hill, its towers silhouetted against the star-pocked sky. His expression shifts as memories flutter through him. Ariana's laughter echoing in summer fields, Albus's voice carrying promises they were too young to keep, the long years of bitterness that carved deep canyons into his heart. But tonight, those memories no longer wound him. They settle into place like tiles in a mosaic, forming a picture that is both painful and beautiful. He whispers something you can't hear, not an apology, not a regret, but something that feels like release. When he returns inside, the tavern welcomes him with the soft glow of the fire. He sits again, breathes, lets the stillness settle over him like a blanket. The goats shift sleepily in their corners. The lanterns sway with the gentlest sighs of the wind. The world feels soft, whole, quiet. Then, slowly, Aberforth leans back in his chair, folds his arms, and closes his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in ease. Genuine ease, the kind that comes after years of holding breath, of bracing against storms, of carrying grief heavier than mountains. He sleeps lightly at first, then deeper, the lines in his brow smoothing, the tightness in his jaw loosening, and you watch, knowing that this rest, this simple, undramatic moment of peace, is more heroic than any duel he ever fought. Time drifts. Fire crackles, goats snore with the peculiar intensity only goats can manage, and Aberforth remains, breathing steadily in the heart of his tavern, the quiet guardian of a world that has finally stopped collapsing. You sit there with him, watching the lantern light fade into deeper shades of gold. Outside, the stars shimmer like distant guardians. Inside, the air grows calm, warm, full of promises the future has yet to reveal. And as the night deepens toward dawn, as the tavern sinks into stillness, as Aberforth finally begins to dream without fear, the story settles with him, softly, gently, like a final exhale in the long journey toward healing. You understand then that his legacy will never be carved in marble, never sung in ballads, never etched into textbooks. It will live instead in the warm light of a tavern window, in the laughter of students who wander through Hogsmeade without fear, in the quiet resilience of a man who chose, again and again, not to surrender to despair. Aberforth Dumbledore, the forgotten brother, the reluctant guardian, the quiet hero, has found his peace, not through glory, but through endurance, through care, through the stubborn grace of choosing to stay alive in a world that once broke him. The Hogshead breathes steadily around him, the fire crackles, the goats sigh, and somewhere outside, the first bird begins to sing, soft, tentative, hopeful. His story ends not with triumph, but with tranquility, a peace he earned, a peace he built, a peace he finally accepts. In the quiet hours before dawn, the Hogshead rests beneath a blanket of silver moonlight, its windows glowing with the gentle warmth of a place that has finally learned how to breathe again. Inside, Aberforth sleeps in his chair, one hand resting loosely on the wooden table, the other dangling toward the floor where a loyal goat has curled up beside him. The fire has burned down to soft embers, glowing like tiny hearts still beating in the ashes. Nothing stirs except the steady rhythm of peaceful breathing, the whisper of wind along the eaves, and the faint creak of timber settling after a long, storied life. In this stillness, you sense the truth that history often overlooks. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who stand in the shadows, holding up the world quietly, while others take the stage. Aberforth never sought praise, never asked to be remembered, never wanted anything more than a place to belong. Yet here, surrounded by warmth and quiet, his legacy shines brighter than any spell. The night deepens, softens, and finally settles, leaving the tavern, the goats, and Aberforth himself wrapped in a peace he has long deserved. Good night.